the Gun Control Act of '68 doesn't specifically ban African Americans or Native Americans from owning guns. Can you expand more on how that worked to do that? Or?
Sure. Obviously, it couldn't have been that blatant. And what it did was list at that time, initially 7 and now up to 9 characteristics of people who would be prohibited from having a firearm. Again, this is different from a drug law that bans a particular drug or substance. The firearms themselves are not banned. Certain classes of people, citizens with certain characteristics, are prohibited from possessing this otherwise lawful item. And when you look at those characteristics, if you think in 1968, all court records everywhere were kept by hand on index cards. There was nowhere to look to see if you had a felony or to look to see if you had a particular one of these other disqualifying characteristics. So who was prohibited by federal law depended on the applied knowledge of local law enforcement, which could be phenomenally selective, as well as local prosecutors and judges. And depending on where you were in the country, that collective memory could be, or would obviously be, extremely biased racially and in terms of class.
Very problematic.
Add to that the fact that if even today our jails are primarily full of Black and Hispanic citizens, and there's an entire bias in enforcement and a socioeconomic bias, which leads to much higher proportions of Black males and Hispanic males as compared to white males or women having criminal convictions. Therefore, if one of your characteristic is anyone who's been convicted in a court of any crime with a potential punishment exceeding a year, the people who would leap obviously to mind and be known to law enforcement as meeting that characteristic would be either your minority citizens or anyone else who was targeted as a troublemaker. Because if you're known as a political activist and a troublemaker, it's real easy to pick up a felony trespass at a protest somewhere. Then there's an excuse to go into your home or your neighborhood or your business place looking for your firearms because you have a prohibiting characteristic. If you're a fugitive from justice, if you've been adjudicated mentally defective or committed to a mental institution, and if we look back to the 60s, many places in the country had large eugenics movements through the 30s and 40s, which committed people who were called feeble-minded to institutions. Feeble-minded people were people who didn't work in accordance with the sort of upper to middle class standards and were deemed, to be not with the program, so to speak. So if you'd been institutionalized, or you were from one of those families where someone had been institutionalized, you were prohibited from having a firearm. Another one is if you're an unlawful user or addicted to unlawful drugs, even if you don't have any conviction whatsoever. And certainly, again, looking at the time, the black reefer smoking culture, that went with the whole jazz movement, and again, many sort of political ne'er-do-wells, and again, Native Americans who perhaps utilized at the time unlawful drugs. And all that had to happen was that your law enforcement officer had to believe that you were an unlawful user. You didn't have to have a conviction. Even today, I've had people who've had Brady denials because they've got a ponytail and a Harley, so we all know they must smoke pot, and therefore they're an unlawful user of drugs and can
Are there
be
any
denied.
guidelines that make sense as far as ensuring that someone with a violent criminal past won't get their hands on a handgun, or at least not legally? Or is that futile to even think about?
Well, the current rule, of course, is that anyone convicted of any crime with a potential year or more sentence, although it's actually a lot trickier than that because the federal law relies on state law definitions. And in some states, even if you've got a violent conviction, if your rights, for instance, to vote have been reinstated, then the conviction no longer counts for a firearms prohibition. So there are probably a fair number of people out there who have convictions for at least something we might consider violent that are in fact permitted under the federal system to have firearms. states clearly can be that specific if they would like to. They can say that persons convicted of murder, rape, arson, kidnapping, the sort of life imprisonment type crimes, could not have a firearm if they wanted to be that that specific. Of course, that doesn't remotely preclude anyone from obtaining a firearm through
illegally,
unlawful means.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, because as noble as it is to try to keep them out of the hands of people you don't want them to be in, the more you regulate it, the more it's just going to create a black market, and they're going to get them one way or another. Prohibition didn't make alcohol or drugs go away, and I don't believe it'll make guns go away either.
That's true, and the other part of that is that both gun control advocates and firearms owners have spent a lot of time and energy talking about crime and crime statistics. And that has been the basis of discussion for the question of should there be gun control, should there not be gun control. Again, gun control is really social control. It's not intended to remove guns from the world or any portion of it. It's intended, quite frankly, to ensure that only the so-called right people have guns. As the handgun advocate who I quoted earlier, who said if you're a big white guy who hunts all the time, it might do some good to be carrying a firearm. I've never come across anyone who seriously thinks that any state or the federal government will take away $10,000 shotguns from white guys who duck hunt, which means it's not about the gun, it's about who's carrying it. It's okay for upper-class white men to carry a firearm, but it's deeply troubling to most people to think about a young black man or a young black woman or the Asian shopkeeper in a poor neighborhood or the poor black farmer. We saw the black farmers protesting this week in Washington about discrimination in farmers' loans. It's still a very live issue. And many black farmers in the South are subjected to continual harassment on racial grounds, and having a firearm at their home, they are an American citizen and a typical firearm owner, if you will, and yet for many people that's a troubling image, whereas the white guy in the SUV with the duck gun is not a socially troubling issue. So it is really an echo of our perceptions about demographics and our perceptions of social control.
So on some level, almost all of us racially profile in some way or another.
Certainly, certainly. And when you look at these characteristics from prohibiting owning firearms, again, it's that people's image of a criminal is a young black or Hispanic guy in a city using a gun in connection with, a drug trade. And clearly that's illegal. If you use a gun in connection with a crime, if you use a gun to do harm to someone, you have done a grave disservice to all of us citizens, and you have violated a right of the rest of us. You have done a grave disservice to all of us who own firearms, but it is in no way typical of firearms owners, in the same way that most men don't rape people or sexually assault people, and the fact that some men do is not typical of half of the species.
The difference between a shopper and a shoplifter.
Right.
Two very different people.
Yep.
Given the present political climate, what do you think firearms owners and groups could be doing differently to protect their rights?
One of the things I think it's very important for all of us who are firearms owners to do is to do a bit of a better job at explaining ourselves and at reaching out and explaining our sport and our hobby and our or why firearms are important to us for self-protection, whatever our interest may be. The perception of the firearms owner is not only that picture of the either the, as I said, the duck hunter or the sort of militia guy, but it also is so firmly tied in most people's minds to a very conservative social agenda or very conservative political agenda. There is an automatic leap if you own a firearm. Many people perceive that you are, for instance, an advocate of right to life, as opposed to abortion rights or reproductive rights, that you are pro-death penalty and not opposed to the death penalty, perhaps that you have a certain set of religious views. And I'm a pro-choice advocate, and I'm firmly against the death penalty. I certainly do not fall within what many people perceive of as the rest of the package of political positions that would go with firearms ownership. But certainly I know many other firearms owners who don't fit that mold of all those other issues. And it behooves all of us to speak up, to introduce ourselves to non-firearms owners, to tell other firearms owners that there's a whole range of us out there. And to speak about firearms in terms of civil rights and respecting one another's differing political opinions on other matters. Again, I think the firearms right protects the full spectrum of political opinion. And I've, oddly enough, as I've been speaking a lot about this in the course of my Attorney General's campaign, I have found it considerably a very welcome audience among people who are interested in other civil rights issues to think for the first time of firearms as a civil right and as a social power issue and as a
diversity issue.
Right, and
Absolutely.
It's very disconcerting to me, but I have found that an easier leap for many people to make than for many of the very conservative firearms owners to respect my position on reproductive
pro-choice,
rights, or in Vermont the civil unions, which is our new state law that we have regarding same-gender couples that can have the legal recognition similar to marriage, which is a proposition that I supported, and many very conservative firearms owners have had more difficulty accepting that than non-firearms owners who are interested in civil rights have had accepting firearms. But there's many things we can agree to disagree on, and our firearms rights secures the free debate on these other subjects.
Do you find that a lot of conservatives feel that you're liberal, a lot of liberals feel that you're conservative?
I think I confuse many people. Absolutely. I've actually often jestingly said I'm somewhat your worst nightmare. I'm a liberal woman lawyer with a gun.
Right.
But that I have found that gets many people thinking, because I certainly
more than turns them off, perhaps.
Absolutely, and I certainly am passionate about my firearms ownership, and I'm not willing to trade that for other civil rights. This is, again, one of the areas that I think gun owners are perhaps falling into the trap of talking about, for instance, talking about crimes and gun control as a crime issue. Some of the leading firearms organizations will come out and say there is this crime issue, and therefore what we need to do is take away bail, take away rights of appeal, punish these criminals more harshly. In other words, they're willing to give up Fourth Amendment or Fifth Amendment rights or other due process rights in the criminal arena to protect the firearms right. And I think that is just as potentially evil or damaging to our democracy as giving up the firearms right. I'm not willing to trade it. I'm not willing to accept
it. Seems very problematic, because no matter how heinous a crime someone has done, they still deserve to have a fair trial.
Absolutely.
Just in and of itself.
Absolutely. They certainly do, and that was
because we become even worse than they do if we don't give them a fair trial.
Right. And that was the point of wisdom of our founding fathers in Thomas Jefferson standing out far among them, and certainly in crafting the Bill of Rights. One of the chief complaints of the colonies was that when you were arrested here, you couldn't get the rights of trial that you had in England, or you had to be shipped back over there where you then didn't have your witnesses and so on. And those rights of criminal due process are extraordinarily important. It's not about what that guy deserves, so to speak, if we are able to judge what someone deserves, but rather it's about how we as a society are going to treat the transgressions which do occur.